The Spitfire is probably the most famous aeroplane ever to grace the skies. Its fluid lines are instantly recognizable. The roar of its Merlin engine delights the senses of young and old. That sight and sound revive memories of its finest hour, the Battle of Britain. Of course, for all its charisma, Spitfire was a killer. Designed in the 1930s, made famous in the 40s, and still the favourite of the airshow scene in the 1990s. In the early 1930s, Germany began to rebuild her air force with modern fighters and bombers. In Britain, the Royal Air Force still had to contend with outdated biplanes. They coped perfectly well in their role of policing the far-flung outposts of the British Empire, but it was obvious they'd be no match for a modern, well-armed enemy. New bombers were needed, heavier aircraft that could fly further and carry bigger bomb loads. But most of all, the RAF needed new fighters to replace the pretty little biplanes that flew barely faster than 200 miles an hour and couldn't even reach the bomber formations. So in 1934, the Air Ministry issued a specification for a new monoplane fighter. It had to carry 8 guns, and that was a radical advance over the twin and 4-gun fighters of the day. It also had to go faster than any previous British military aircraft, faster than 300 miles an hour. This far-sighted specification would need completely new thinking in aircraft design. Since the First World War, Supermarine had built modest quantities of flying boats for the RAF. Starting with the Southampton in 1925, Supermarine aircraft had fulfilled the maritime patrol requirements of the RAF for the next 15 years. That in itself was no grounding for the design and manufacture of an advanced fighter. But it was a new series of aircraft starting in 1927 that brought the company to the attention of the Air Ministry. Supermarine had decided to enter a new series of fast, sleek seaplanes in the Schneider Trophy air races. They were powered by a new brand of specially developed Rolls-Royce racing engines. Between 1927 and 1931, Supermarine's chief designer, R.J. Mitchell, built faster and faster aircraft that eventually won the Schneider Trophy outright. These aircraft were flying at speeds far beyond the reach of anything the RAF could do. In fact, the S6B design that won the 1931 trophy also gained the world speed record of 379 miles an hour.
The experience of the Schneider Trophy aeroplane certainly helped Supermarine. He learned an awful lot about power and speed. But I think mainly design improvements, like the elliptical wing, of course, was a great success.
But it certainly did. It left us with the design and aerodynamic knowledge to go on to high-speed aircraft. And of course, from that, the Spitfire finally.
Mitchell's success inspired him to further development. He had designed a gull-wing monoplane to an earlier Air Ministry specification. Although it didn't get the contract, that went to yet another biplane design, the Gloucester Gladiator. Mitchell continued with his designs. He altered the wings, added a retractable undercarriage and an enclosed cockpit. But possibly the major change was in the engine. The Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine of his previous design was replaced with the brand new Rolls-Royce PV-12, soon to be christened the Merlin. By the end of 1934, Mitchell was able to forecast the likely performance of his new aircraft, and it was so impressive that the Air Ministry rewrote their specification to fit Mitchell's aircraft. The prototype of the Spitfire first flew on March the 5th, 1936. It electrified everybody watching. Within 4 months, the Ministry had ordered 310 production aircraft.
The Spitfire was unique. It was unique because most low-wing monoplanes, they behave perfectly in the air, but many of the low-wing monoplanes, when you came into land, depending on your load configuration, would be a little bit tricky on the actual touchdown due to the flow from the wings over the empennage. But the Spitfire, by virtue of its wing, the little twist in the wing, the flow over the empennage, you could land that under any conditions with a high angle of attack for a 3-point landing, and unless a silly thing like a camera door on the root end of the starboard wing was open, it would put down absolutely perfectly. No, the first time I flew the Spitfire, to me it was straight away, it's a thoroughbred.
It may have been smooth to fly, but it was a difficult aircraft to build. The wing was built in separate sections to make up that elliptical shape, unlike the traditional one-piece wing. The guns had to be spaced out along the wing in separate bays rather than together in groups of 4 on each side. And work on parts of the aircraft had to be subcontracted to more than 200 companies all over the United Kingdom. It was to be 2 years before the first aircraft came off the production line. By the time of the Munich crisis in 1938, only 3 Spitfires had been delivered to a single squadron, number 19, at Duxford near Cambridge. By that time, 100 examples of another monoplane fighter had already been delivered. The Hawker Hurricane had been developed virtually in tandem with the Spitfire, but because it was a simpler design, it was easier to manufacture. But at a time of impending war, 103 modern fighters was far too few to provide a serious defence force for Britain. But as the need for more Spitfires became crucial, Vickers began to build a government-sponsored factory at Castle Bromwich near Birmingham. This vast site would manufacture more than 11,000 Spitfires over the next few years. But this was 1938, and the opening of the factory was still a long way off. The Southampton works of Supermarine had to soldier on, trying to reach the targets set by the RAF. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, 10 squadrons had been re-equipped with Spitfires. But when the British Expeditionary Force set off for France, the Spitfires stayed at home. There were still problems to iron out, and it was felt that French airfields, with their lack of maintenance facilities, wouldn't suit the narrow-tracked undercarriage. So the Spitfires had a quiet start to the war. But their peace was to be rudely shattered at the end of May 1940, when they were called out in support of the evacuation from Dunkirk. After the evacuation and the surrender of France, Britain stood alone against the might of Germany. German morale was high. Their armed forces had never lost a battle, and it seemed only a matter of time before Britain would succumb in turn. Fighter Command, under the leadership of Hugh Dowding, had a number of cards up its sleeve. First, there was the impressive radar defence systems spread along the south coast of England. That gave the fighters early warning of approaching German aircraft.
Serial number?
Serial 97.
Beacon Hill.
Serial 97, Squadron 32, intercept Raid 45. Correct. Tangmere, Serial 98, Squadron 43, intercept Raid 46. Correct.
Northolt, Kenley, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, North Weald, Debden. Will you warn your controller that this looks like yet another attack on airfields?
Second, the Spitfires and Hurricanes were at least a match for the German fighters. But, perhaps most important of all, they were fighting over their own soil. Operating close to their airfields, they could take off, engage the enemy, land, refuel and rearm, and take off again. That vastly improved their response times. And of course, any British fighter pilot bailing out from his aircraft would be able to rejoin the battle, unlike his German counterpart, who was destined for the nearest prisoner of war camp. It was during the Battle of Britain that the two frontline fighters devised a deadly partnership. The more rugged but slower Hurricanes attacked the German bombers, while the speedy Spitfires took on the German fighter escorts, which were mostly Messerschmitt Me-109s. The conflict between Spitfire and Me-109 was to become a classic of aerial combat. Twisting and turning, trying to get the enemy in sight, scanning the skies for more enemy fighters. Get in close, a quick burst from the machine guns, turn away. During the summer of 1940, losses mounted on both sides. The Germans had begun with more aircraft, and they would always have won a battle of attrition. They bombed RAF airfields daily, and for a time it seemed that Fighter Command could not hold out. few were getting fewer, and reinforcements were thin on the ground. But suddenly, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. They switched their attacks from the airfields to the cities. Unable to beat the RAF, they decided to try pounding the whole country into submission. Taking a deep breath, Fighter Command took advantage of the respite offered to their airfields and regrouped. From that day, the 7th of September, Fighter Command's strength grew constantly. On the 15th, the day that would become known as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe lost more than 60 aircraft during massed attacks on London.
Hello, Keter Leader, short jack answering, loud and clear. Vector 120, 100 plus bandits at 20,000 feet, heading west. Over.
Hello, short jack. Okay, moving out.
Groups up.
Hello, sir. Yes, 3 squadrons are airborne. All right, sir. I'll get all sails from the aircraft off, although it does look as if they're going for the towns and not the airfields. Yes. Our early warning has given us plenty of time this morning to get the boys off.
Hello, short jack. Keter Leader calling. Tally ho, tally ho. High calls with 109s dead ahead. My God, there's hundreds of the baskets. Never seen so many. Hello, Keter Squadron. Blue section, take the bombers. Red section, the fighters with me. Red section, line astern, go.
This was to be the final turning point. Hitler postponed his planned invasion of Britain and transferred his attention to the build-up for an attack on Russia. The battle continued officially until the end of October, but the great threat was over. Fighter Command, Dowding, his pilots, and the Spitfires and Hurricanes had thwarted Hitler's ambition. The Mark I Spitfire and the cannon-firing Mark 1B had borne the brunt of the Battle of Britain, a total of 1,566 being produced. But now the pace of development at Supermarine hotted up. The Mark II with an uprated 1,175 horsepower Merlin 12 engine arrived in December 1940, closely followed in February 1941 by the Mark V, which had a 1,440 horsepower Merlin 45. That Mark V went on to dominate Fighter Command for 2 years. It became the most numerous Mark to be produced. Nearly 6,500 aircraft equipped no less than 117 squadrons.
And so many people ask me, what was your favourite Spitfire? I say straight away, it just depends what you want me to use it for. Is it for firepower, is it for performance, or for handling? And for handling, I would have thought the Mark V with the 24-pound boost engine. With that aircraft, it's the only Spitfire that I flew that you could take off almost from the tarmac in less than 200 yards, pull it up as if going for a loop, and at the top of the loop be able to do a slow roll and then continue upwards to 5,000 feet before you started your show. And that aircraft could be flown at the top of the loop before you started to commence the roll at 15 to 20 miles an hour below its normal stalling speed with a 24-pound boost, and providing you kept the aircraft absolutely positively between negative and positive G. If you put too much G on, positive G, you'd flick. If you didn't have enough of the other, the engine would obviously cut, and the same thing would apply. It's a little bit tricky, but it's the only aircraft that I ever flew, only Spitfire ever flew, that could do that.
These Spitfires participated in numerous fighter sweeps across France, known variously as rodeos, circuses and rhubarbs, in an attempt to carry the fight to the Germans, keeping German fighters in France and away from the Russian front. They also gave the pilots a taste of offensive action after so long on the defensive. Throughout the first 2 years of the war, the Spitfire managed to stay ahead of, or at least on a par with, its main adversary, the Me-109. But the appearance of a new German fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190, at the end of 1941 had a profound effect on fighter command. It was superior in almost every respect. Spitfires were shot down with alarming regularity. The normal orderly pace of supermarine development was now severely tested. The stopgap solution was the Mark 9. It was actually a Mark 5 airframe with the uprated 1660 horsepower Merlin 61 engine. With a maximum speed of just over 400 miles an hour and improved turn and climb performance, the Mark 9 restored the balance of power in the skies over France.
Quantum leap between the Mark 5 to the Mark 9 was such that you just reveled in it. It was just superb. It climbed like a homesick angel, and it got a magnificent turn of speed, and yet it still had the maneuverability of the Mark 5. I loved it.
In fact, far from being the planned stopgap, the Mark 9 stayed in service until the end of the war. It fought in the North African desert, in the Balkans, on home defence, and ultimately with the 2nd Tactical Air Force in Germany in 1945. The total production of Merlin-engined Spitfires reached a staggering 18,298. Many other Marks were built for different jobs. They included high and low altitude interceptors, photographic reconnaissance aircraft, two-seat trainers, fighter bombers, and aircraft specially designed for the tropical climates of the Far East and North Africa. But early in the war, it had been realized that the Merlin engine could only be developed so far. It was now time for a new engine to power the Spitfire through the last years of the war. The Rolls-Royce Griffon was developed from the trophy-winning R series that had been so successful on Mitchell's Schneider seaplanes. It was bigger, with 36.7 litres capacity compared to the Merlin's 27, so the Spitfire had to be 2 feet longer. It was a tribute to Mitchell's original design that the Spitfire had the versatility to take on this new and bigger engine. Possibly the best of the Griffon Spitfires was the Mark 14. It was a truly remarkable fighter. At a height of 26,000 feet, it could fly at 448 miles an hour. It was the first Spitfire to carry an engine with more than 2,000 horsepower. And a testament to its power is that it was used to chase and shoot down V-1 flying bombs. It was also responsible for shooting down the first Me-262. That was the German jet fighter bomber. The Mark 14 carried Spitfires through to the end of the war, and that made it the only aircraft to stay in continuous production from 1939 to 1945. Spitfires continued in service until the 1950s, the last operational sortie being flown against communist forces in Malaya on the 1st of January 1951. There's no doubt that the Spitfire is one of the greatest fighters the world has ever seen. It was a pilot's aircraft with an extraordinary charisma and excitement. Coupled with its high performance, that combination made it the dream aircraft. In the 10 years of its production, 22,000 people were involved in building 20,351 Spitfires. Not one of those people will ever forget the impact of that aircraft. Despite the success of the Hurricane, it was the Spitfire that became the symbol of hope during Britain's darkest days in the summer of 1940. And it was the sound of that Merlin engine in the following years that brought people the feeling of impending victory. That spirit of optimism has continued down the years. Ever since the war years, frontline interceptor fighters, from Lightning to Eurofighter, have been described as the Spitfire of their time. The Hawker Hurricane is one of the most outstanding machines in the history of military aviation. It was the first monoplane interceptor in RAF service, the first combat fighter to exceed 300 miles an hour in level flight, and the first fighter with 8 guns. In the fateful summer of 1940, the qualities of the Hurricane would be tested in the most significant battle of the war, the Battle of Britain. The Hurricane, in the hands of the brave and skilled pilots of Fighter Command, proved to be one of the most important factors in the RAF's final victory. By the end of the First World War, the role of the fighter had been defined. Its task was to win control of the skies over the battlefield and to prevent the enemy from bombing or strafing or spying. The most famous fighter of this war was the Sopwith Camel. Built of wood and wire and canvas, its biplane format gave it tremendous wing area for its size, and that made it immensely maneuverable and well suited for close aerial combat. From this great aircraft, the Hurricane can claim direct lineage because Sopwith evolved into Hawker engineering. In the harsh economic environment that followed the First World War, the demand for military aircraft diminished. With more pressing peacetime requirements and a consequent slashing of military budgets, the RAF was cut back to a skeleton force. But civil aviation flourished. A whole series of records was set in the 1920s. Those achievements weren't lost on the Air Force planners. By the 1930s, large aircraft had the ability to cross national borders and bomb foreign cities. For the first time, civilians could be targeted. It was widely believed that there was no effective defense against a massed bomber force. Fighting fire with fire was deemed the only solution. So Britain's Air Ministry set aside most of the RAF's budget for the development of modern bombers. So fighter development was seriously neglected. The RAF soldiered on into the 1930s with a biplane fighter force reminiscent of the First World War. Hawkers, like most other aircraft manufacturers, were still designing biplanes. In 1924, Sidney Cam had been employed as their chief designer. One of his first projects was the Hawker Hart, a light bomber with a top speed of 184 miles an hour. And that was remarkable for the late 20s. It was faster than RAF fighters of the day. As a result, a fighter version was developed, the Hawker Demon. That entered service with the RAF in 1931. The Demon's successor, the Hawker Fury, broke the 200 miles an hour barrier and represented the pinnacle of Hawker's biplane designs. During these years, Cam gained a reputation for attractive designs. But despite some increases in speed, these latest fighters were already outmoded. In Germany, the Nazis were preparing for war. With tremendous resources allocated to aircraft research, Hitler's designers built modern, fast monoplane bombers. It became vital for the RAF to have faster fighters. At Hawkers, Sidney Cam set about the design of a new aircraft. He was responding to an Air Ministry specification for an 8-gun fighter that could fly faster than 300 miles an hour. That was a full 100 miles an hour faster than the Fury. The new aircraft boasted a new Rolls-Royce engine, the Merlin. But for ease of production, it used the old jigs and tools developed for the Fury. It was constructed from metal tubes supported by wood and covered in fabric. That produced a light but strong aircraft which was rugged and easy to repair. A wide, retractable undercarriage gave it stability on bumpy airfields. On November the 6th, 1935, K5083, the Hurricane prototype, made its first flight from Brooklands airfield. Now fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin C engine producing 1,030 horsepower, the aircraft had a top speed of 315 miles an hour at 16,000 feet. After extensive trials at the Aeroplane and Armament Establishment at Martlesham Heath, the aircraft was approved for production. The first aircraft off the production line was delivered to the RAF in October 1937. The intervening 16 months had been used productively to fine-tune the basic design. It now boasted 8 US-built Colt Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. They were mounted just outside the arc of the propeller. That gave the aircraft accurate and concentrated firepower. Each gun was supplied with 300 rounds, allowing 14 seconds of continuous fire. With international tension increasing, the RAF finally had its first modern fighter, one which was a potential deterrent. On September the 1st, 1939, Nazi forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The British Expeditionary Force was sent to France, and with it went 4 squadrons of Hurricanes. In May 1940, Germany invaded Holland, Belgium and France, and by the middle of the month, the British and the French were fighting a rearguard action. France wanted more aircraft, and 4 further Hurricane squadrons were sent. But in Britain, the Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, Sir Hugh Dowding, had strong reservations. He wanted to conserve his force for the inevitable battle for Britain. Churchill heeded his advice, and no more frontline fighters were sent. This decision was to prove vital in the coming months. A few months before, the Hurricane had tasted its first blood. An aircraft from No. 1 Squadron had shot down a Dornier 17 on October the 13th, 1939. As the weeks passed, the Hurricanes notched up further kills, and it was clear that the aircraft was a potent force against the bombers. But the Hurricanes' first engagement against German fighters was less impressive. On December the 22nd, 1939, 3 Hurricanes were set upon by German fighters diving from above and behind. The lethal Messerschmitt 109 proved to be more than a match for the Hurricane. Had 2 cannon as well as 2 machine guns. The 109 could fire from greater range, and its explosive shells could penetrate armour plating. In addition, the ME 109 had a bigger engine. That gave it a higher top speed and a greater rate of climb. Between May the 28th and June the 4th, more than 330,000 British, French and Belgian troops were evacuated from the beaches at Dunkirk. The Hurricane squadrons were rapidly withdrawn, leaving behind valuable spares and tools. And so began the intense period of preparation before Hitler turned his ambitions to Britain. Losses in the French fighting had been heavy, with almost 200 Hurricanes destroyed. But those early aerial combats had taught Fighter Command some valuable lessons. Guns on the Hurricanes were reset at 250 yards range, rather than the previous 650, and that gave more concentrated and effective fire. The gun lubricating oil was thinned down with paraffin to stop it freezing at altitude. Moisture in the gun barrels was prevented by taping fabric over the gun ports. and the unofficial practice of fitting armour plate behind the pilot now became standard. Though the situation seemed grave, with the German armies massing just across the Channel, there were some definite advantages in Britain's favour. As an island nation, Britain had a natural barrier between her and the invasion forces. The second advantage was, however, man-made: radar. Screens were monitored 24 hours each day, and when echoes appeared, the operator could measure the range, the height, bearing, and numbers of enemy aircraft. This information was then passed to Fighter Command and eventually to operations rooms. Controllers could then vector fighters to intercept. This network allowed the RAF to conserve its resources and pick its targets, rather than sending squadrons off on endless searches over southern England. Even at this late stage, continual improvements were being made to the Hurricanes. From March 1940, all new aircraft off the production line had metal wings and upgraded Merlin engines, contributing an all-round improved performance. The Hurricane's partner in defence, the Spitfire, was all metal. It shared the same engine and armament, but the Spitfire's flying characteristics were completely different. It was more streamlined, faster and more manoeuvrable. So the Spitfire was better suited to taking on the German fighters, while the Hurricanes intercepted the bombers. From the middle of July, the Luftwaffe began attacks on Channel convoys. On the 20th, during a raid, Dover Harbour was also attacked. For the first time, RAF fighters were sent up in numbers. It was the first big dogfight of the battle. But Dowding had to tread a fine line. He had to conserve his fighter strength, knowing that the main thrust was still to come, but he also had to do what he could to protect the shipping. At this time, Fighter Command only possessed 57 squadrons of fighters. 29 of them operated Hurricanes. 17 of these were part of 11 Group, which would bear the brunt of the fighting in the southeast.
Once I had almost run out of ammunition, having shot down one 109 into the sea, and then attacked the second one, hit him, but wasn't able to finish him off, and followed him down over the sea over Folkestone Harbour, and was able to form mate on him as he was only doing about 200 miles an hour. And finally, in order to make sure he went down, I slapped his port tail plane off with the tip of my starboard wing. And about 3 feet came off the wing tip of my starboard wing and flew into the air, and we were down at about 200 feet and he went into the sea.
On August the 12th, the Luftwaffe mounted its first major raid on radar stations and airfields. 36 German aircraft were shot down for the loss of 13 British machines. The following day was scheduled as Adlertag, or Eagle Day, the day that the Germans count as the beginning of the battle. Believing that 6 radar stations had been knocked out, a large force of German bombers attacked through bad weather. They expected to reach their targets undetected. That day, 47 German aircraft failed to reach their bases for the loss of 13 British fighters. As it turned out, the massed synchronized raids of Eagle Day had been disrupted by the weather. A second attempt was made on the 15th. "520 bombers with 1,270 escort fighters attacked in unison. caused heavy damage to southern airfields and factories. But the damage was too scattered to have a major effect on Fighter Command's effectiveness. To make matters worse, the day scheduled to start the downfall of Britain turned into a German rout. To the Luftwaffe, it became known as Black Thursday. The losses on both sides were never to be exceeded in the battle.
It became almost a routine, and you dash out your aircraft, and you could go from being fast asleep to being up in the air in under 2 minutes. As you were climbing up and doing your cockpit checks, the controller would give you over the radio the height you had to climb to, the distance to the enemy aircraft that were coming in, their altitude, and probably their compass direction as well. And with the aids of radar, these interceptions were spot on every time. After you run out of ammunition, you would peel off and dive down to the nearest fighter airfield. We knew them all very well. Then the ground crews would rearm the aircraft, refuel them, and this they could do in about 15, 20 minutes. And then you would be off again.
Over the following weeks, pilots on both sides displayed tremendous courage and skill. But by the autumn, the Germans had failed to gain air superiority. Without it, the invasion of Britain was postponed, as it turned out, indefinitely. The RAF had, by the narrowest of margins, contained the greatest air force the world had ever seen. 461 RAF pilots had been killed out of a total force of less than 1,000. 915 aircraft had been destroyed. But post-war figures revealed that the Germans had lost 1,733 aircraft. The Hurricane had proved itself in battle. Its rugged airframe could sustain far more damage than any other fighter. That, together with the fact that it was a very stable gun platform, made it the most successful fighter of the battle. It had been appreciated from an early date that the basic Hurricane had considerable development potential. With the introduction of the new Merlin 20 engine, this version became the Hurricane 2A. In early 1941, the Hurricane 2A SRS-2 was introduced. That had interchangeable wings. More armament was added, greatly improving the Hurricane's hitting power. The first variant, the 2B, had 12.303 machine guns and provision for two 250-pound or two 500-pound bombs underneath. Second variant was the 2C, which was armed with 4 Hispano-Suiza 20mm cannon. The RAF had known full well that the cannon represented more hitting power than the machine gun, but development had been slow and it was beset with mechanical problems. Trials as early as 1939 showed a number of defects, and it was not until the summer of 1941 that these were ironed out. In total, 80 squadrons were eventually equipped with the cannon firing 2Cs.
As an armament fitter, I was responsible for rearming all the aircraft on our flight. The first aircraft we got were the 8 303 machine gun aircraft. So you had 4 303 Browning machine guns in each wing. The next, after several operations up and down the desert, we were returned to base to re-equip with newer aircraft, and we got the 12-gun Hurricane fighter. That had 6 machine guns at each wing. The bank of 4 here and 2 outboard on each wing. And then ultimately the Hurricane was developed, of course, because of its very deep chord wing. It could accept the 20mm cannon very easily without putting the blisters on the top or underneath, as you have to do with a Spitfire. So the Hurricane became a very good aircraft on that score.
When the Hurricane's planned life as a fighter had virtually come to an end in 1942, the introduction of yet another wing was to rejuvenate this remarkable aircraft. Known as the 2D, this Mark was now armed with 2 40mm anti-tank guns plus 1 harmonised machine gun for sighting.
Target below. Hurricanes peel off and swoop down to the attack. The German tank is blazing now, finished, knocked clean out of the war by the tremendous power of fire from the tank busters' cannons. The job has been well done. And so the flight reforms and heads for home, for the little camp, which, wherever it may be, is the center of the squadron's life.
The success of the wing variations led to the final production version called the Hurricane 4. That had the powerful Merlin 24 or 27 engines. Here it's operating from a temporary strip in Calcutta. The new universal wing made the Mark IV a highly specialised ground attack aircraft. It was used to a particularly devastating effect against the Japanese in Burma. The Hurricane's ultimate firepower was achieved by the installation of a weapon system first proposed in 1941 and tested on the Hurricane in February 1942. The Hurricane 4 became the first of all Allied aircraft to use rockets operationally. It led to newspaper headlines claiming that the little Hurricane packed a punch equivalent to the broadside from a destroyer. One of the main reasons for the longevity of the Hurricane was the problem-ridden development of its successor, the Hawker Typhoon. Typhoon was developed by Sidney Cam in 1937 and first flown in 1940, but it took 3 more years before it realised its full potential and started to take over from the Hurricane in the ground attack role. The Hurricane's operational life extended well beyond the end of the war, and it was not until January 1947 that the last squadron, number 6, relinquished its Hurricanes. With a total of 14,543 built, it was undoubtedly one of the great fighter aircraft of the Second World War.